Hey everybody, how are you guys doing? I'm Eric Airlock, and this is another talk, a follow-up talk, on my theories of Alice in Wonderland. Specifically, I've given a talk now, and this is what I presented to the Lewis Carroll Society, and I'm very thankful for their support, and their hopefully their enthusiasm somewhat about these theories. Again, I am very interested in hearing counter theories or problems with the theories. The Society was right, by the way, to point out the wasp and the wig does complexify things, but again, and they are instrumental in coming up with the wasp and the wig and publishing that, and I'm thankful for all of that. And I do think that is part of substance and absence in the second, it's a bit of substance and absence, and continuing the themes in the ending chapters is what I would say. But this is, given that I have not yet had anybody comprehensively, it doesn't mean my theories are right, but haven't had anybody come back against things and give me good counter arguments to things yet, other than I'm a loony, which is certainly true. That has nothing to do with the theory, though, does it? That I am going to now give you my more speculative part of the theory that I think there is enough evidence solidly there. As I started to line up things with Aristotle in the categories, I could not help but notice that it is likely that the four forms of proposition, the second major idea of Aristotle's logic, the first most if you're doing anything like modern logic, because the four forms of proposition become the four syllogisms, the four forms of argument, and the four corners of the square of opposition, essentially. All, none, some, and some not. I think that those are there, hiding in plain sight, as Poe would put, a purloined letter, in the four royal court characters of each of the adventures. And then I also have theories about that, and that this is sort of a slight but overarching part of also the Carroll-Aristotle correlations here. That white and red and black are Aristotle uses in his categories and on interpretation and works on logic that I'm pulling all of this from primarily. I am sticking to the Organon, simply the small number of books. I believe there are 6. I pull almost all of this from the first 3, from the Organon, from On Interpretation, and Prior Analytics. Anybody who's familiar with Aristotle's logic or its connection to modern logic would understand. I am only pulling the primary. We're not even talking about the sophistical refutations, logical fallacies, and all the wordplay of Carroll, and somebody could just continue on and on with all of that, and I can, and you can see my video on that. But this is a follow-up video in which I explain how the White Rabbit, the Duchess, the Queen of Hearts, and the King of Hearts could stand for some not, none, off with their head, and all conflicting testimony. Sure, important, unimportant. And then I think that because it's a little bit messy in the first story of the categories in the 4, which I think that Carroll clarified matters even more, and in the follow-up sequel, Looking Glass, he made the 4 forms of proposition the 4 kings and queens of Wonderland, the red and white king and queen, making the 4, which is even clearer on a chessboard, which is like a square of opposition, or the game of logic that Carroll presented. Alice is presented as going to the top and then having queens on either side, although that's not quite a chess game. That is more a presentation of what I would call proto-psychology, and Carroll's expressions about logic and emotions, and how all of that is interrelated. But I think that he not only clarified the categories by having time turn into space with the White Queen morphing into the sheep in the same chapter, and you can see the themes of time turning into the themes of space in that same chapter, which clarifies things compared to the mix-up muddle of the Cheshire Cat, which I still think works strong as space in Relations, the House of the Duchess. But I think as Carroll went along, he clarified these ideas in the sequel, and then I think he did present these ideas in The Hunting of the Snark. I, as of yet, do not have any theories about how the 4 forms of proposition work with The Hunting of the Snark. I have this or that suspicion, but I don't actually have anything solid. All of this, what I am presenting, by the way, is what seemed to emerge from my reading of Aristotle, which is why I am not venturing to read the 4 forms of proposition into the Snark. I am not, believe it or not, trying to read everything into everything. I am simply presenting the categories, which I've already presented, line up with, backwards, as I presented, in the order Aristotle presents them, from passion to substance, Wonderland, and the Looking Glass. And then here is where I'm going to argue just a bit that the four forms of proposition very much line up with the rabbit, the duchess, and the king and the queen, and then the two queens and the two kings of Wonderland and Looking Glass apiece. And then I'm going to follow with just a hint of what Aristotle says about white and red, how that does line up with the white-red themes that do frame both texts, and then gold is the golden beyond. I am not sure that Aristotle, as I've mentioned, uses gold in the way Carroll does, but Aristotle's idea of balance were identified with the golden mean, golden ratio, and could be a golden key of sorts. Balance is golden. So I don't know that Aristotle says balance is golden, but that would be red, white, and black matching what Aristotle says in the categories and on interpretation. And then golden is the golden beyond, which begins the Alice adventures, the golden afternoon, and then the snark begins a gold as well. So let's get to it here, and I'll just read my presentation again. So my first suggestion of the two here, I'm going to have one about the category, the four forms of proposition, and then one about the colors. So my first suggestion, after plotting out the categories in Alice's adventures and finding some sort of solution for the snark hunt, is that the four royal court characters of each of Alice's adventures could stand for the four forms of proposition. All, none, some, and some not. Not in the same order, by the way. It isn't, and I don't have a good theory as to what that is. I'll mention that here. In Aristotle's On Interpretation, the second book of his works on logic, so the categories, the first and foremost idea of that is the categories, the 10. So that's what I've been going over. In the second book, you have the first and foremost idea is the four forms of proposition, and then that works into everything about syllogisms and forms of logic, and then what modern logicians call the square of opposition. So we, on interpretation, following the categories, Aristotle presents four forms of proposition, four ways we say things are true or not. We say things are positive and inclusive, that would be all, including all positively. Positive here doesn't mean happy, because all of something could be all the scorpions. It's not happy, it is yes, everything as opposed to no, nothing, or some as opposed to some not. Yes, that kind of positive and negative. There's a lot of those in thought that don't have to do with emotions, and emotions have their own positives and negatives, and all this can intertwine and intermatch to make thought, meaning, truth. Lies, everything that's meaningful. Not just truth. Truth is as meaningful as lies. Lies could be even more meaningful at times. It could mean the most, unfortunately, in this or that instance to this or that individual. So, with all of that, you have positive and include all, such as all apples are round, sticking to very simple examples. Positive and include some, such as some apples are round. I believe that that is the King of Hearts and his assistant, the White Rabbit, in Wonderland. And I believe it is the White Queen and the White King, actually, with the Queen moving universally full board and the King moving one space in Looking Glass. You then have the other side of the square, the negative and excluding all, no apples are round, all these ways are mine means none of these ways are yours, and off with your head means none of you anymore, which would make the Queen of Hearts and the Red Queen. That's not a hard sell, I think, compared to the rest, which is harder to fit into form a bit, but is there, I think. And then there is negative and excluding some, such as some apples are not round. I believe that this is the Duchess and the Red King in Wonderland and the Looking Glass, because the Duchess does talk to everybody and is, well, somewhat, not everybody. She actually is a little bit ignoring people, not as much as the Red King, but she's terrible at relations, back and forth. And while relations is confusing with position, Aristotle doesn't do the greatest job of teasing all these completely apart, but position, I think the Red King is with position and Tweedledum and D in the Looking Glass, and he is including Alice in his dream, but barely, and seems asleep to her. So that is actually inclusive a bit, but quite exclusive. So I think that is the Red King. And that would make the Red Queen to the Red King none to some not. So this pair of pairs form the positive and inclusive, all, negative and exclusive, none, negative and excluding, negative and partial, some, positive and partial, some, and negative and partial, some not. So all apples are round, no apples are round, some apples are round, some apples are not round. And yes, Carroll specifically talks about how not some apples are round, some apples are not round are different, and he is critical of logicians for not recognizing multiple connections here. That is going to be important in a moment. So these four form what logicians call the corners of the square of opposition. That was not Aristotle or the original peripatetic Aristotelian's form. I think it is Boethius, if I'm not mistaken, in the Middle Ages at least, for Europe, but I don't know elsewise. So with two propositions are positive, two are negative, and then that overlaps. I have similar theories about emotion, actually. It overlaps with that universal and partial overlap with positive and negative. Vogue, yes? So, we're going to move to the music here. And you have Carroll argued in his work on logic that only the first three are necessary, as some and none, as I just somewhat mentioned, can serve together as some not. Now, you'll notice the Duchess is not there in the end of Wonderland, in the trial. I think that's actually that the Queen glares down some not leaves, or is locked down and arrested. And you have then, with all of that, the rabbit is some and bounces between all or none. He is on the side of the king in the image. But look at that image of the court trial, and it does look a bit of a square of opposition. Forgive me. Yes. So, with all of that, in Wonderland, the white rabbit is characterized as overly inclusive and particular, who worries about the needs of his superiors and orders Alice into his house to look after his own things. So in fact, he's not nice or sane, but he's characterized as man and beast and overly inclusive and including Alice in his house. Now, Alice gets into the Duchess's house. I am saying here the square of opposition and then Lewis Carroll's game of logic, which is not the same exact thing as the square of opposition, but is based on it very much. And both are based on the four forms of proposition. That the Duchess has a house, the Queen has a garden, and the King has a court. That would make four corners. You have the rabbit's house, which is a some and some situation, inclusive, but back and forth. You have the Duchess, who is living in a very exclusionary, including a lot of people, but actually being terrible to them and ignorant of them. Is characterized by ignorance of the baby who turns into the pig much. And that's some to some not in the switching of the baby to the pig, in a sense. That the Duchess is overly exclusive, but she's also particular. Now that, of course, the Queen seems a bit more just so upset that anybody would violate any rule. The Duchess seems quite self-centered, and that would make her exclusive but also particular, which is why the Queen glares down at her, says, "Why don't you leave and you're not useful?" And the Duchess takes off. So... And that all actually is in the Queen's garden. In the Queen's garden of none, you don't need some not, according to Carroll, and in his work, his game of logic and symbolic logic. I believe it's in both of those, that you only need some, you do not need some not. But he includes the Duchess and then excludes her, oddly enough. She ignores the needs of her cook. She punishes the cries of her baby while cuddling it weirdly, or at least tossing it up and down or something, hopefully cuddling it occasionally. Or not so much, but that would be inclusive to the baby, but then being self-centered towards the baby altogether, active abuse, as opposed to passive neglect for Alice, who leaves it in the woods, effectively to die, sadly. Whether or not it's a pig probably left in the woods would suffer a similar fate. So she moralizes about, the Duchess moralizes about who and what is best or worst back and forth in very confusing ways. But she's she's not very good with morals, which may mean it is the Queen of Hearts who is none and all of none, like her counterpart, the Red Queen, who is all too good in a certain sense with laws and rules, whereas the Duchess struggles in foolish ways. That's a possibility. The Queen of Hearts is overly exclusive in general. Everybody knows the Queen of Hearts is off with your head entirely, right? And thus off with you entirely. Exclusion from the set. Ordering the complete subtraction, I do believe she is quantity decently, of anyone who displeases her in the slightest. from her garden and existence. That is even more exclusive than the Duchess, yes? And the King of Hearts is overly inclusive in general, who includes all conflicting testimony, important, unimportant, maybe that's good, and the rabbit, who now serves, the white rabbit, who serves as the role of some and some not, is the one who critiques the king, contradicts the king, says, "Sire," and the king's like, "Oh." That the some is going to qualify, the rabbit as some is qualifying all, because you can qualify with all, and then you also have none. Quite contradictory-wise. Forgive me. I didn't want to sip water all through this. Anyhow. So that is... also fits up with another pattern. That the two male royal characters, the rabbit and the king, are overly inclusive. The two female characters, the Duchess and the Queen, are overly exclusive. The rabbit and Duchess, each with their own particular house, the first two royal characters, are often overly particular and partial, but not entirely. That is why the White Rabbit, I'm late. He's concerned with his own and someone else's interests together, and he's also absurdly human and beast. Conjoined. I was looking too hard for a conjunction formally initially, but formal conjunctions in Lewis Carroll's day were De Morgan, and I think he is thinking of him and including him a bit, but were not solidified until the truth tables much. Even Frege had not put them down in ways like Wittgenstein did with his truth tables, so that had not happened yet. So that's why Lewis Carroll is trying to see how many corners of the Aristotle square of opposition he needs to be better or worse than Boole in his own eyes with a lot of this, is what he was doing in his day. I have videos on all of that, please see that. So, but what we have, and this is actually an interesting reversal. Now, we know that Alice's family, from accounts, that the father was a brilliant scholar, but he was somewhat timid, like the White Rabbit and the King of Hearts, the male characters here. And Alice's mother, as well as the governesses, like the Red Queen, that were in charge more so of Alice and her sisters and their behavior, were rather a bit, let's say, sometimes aggressive and insistent. Now, what that would mean, interestingly enough, and I'm not going to go into theories about emotion and gender right here, I do think there is a lot of evidence, and I am not the one to police gender or say it's categorical, but a lot of masculinity seems to be about displaying negative emotions and then withholding those or displaying those. And a lot about femininity is displaying positive emotions or withholding those. Now, that's something others I pull and crib from other psychologists. I can't name names, unfortunately. And to the degree I'm wrong and things are complex, of course, listen to everyone. But in that, this is a reversal which is absurd, which actually attracts the child's attention, but also would if your parents are somewhat like that. In Alice's family, the male is the non-aggressive, somewhat white queen, open, childlike character, and the female is the harsher, more disciplinarian. Again, if I'm getting any of that wrong, my apologies, and I am not trying to police or guard anybody's identity or behavior. It does seem like, and I have theories, I call it the tombstone model for myself, which is that you can see in westerns and horror movies that men often do or don't signal negativity and violence, and then women often do or don't signal positivity and sex. And I think those are basic behavioral buttons. I don't think we have to live any kind of way we do or don't want to, of course, as individuals. But, that being said, you have here... And I make comments about all of this being straight, red-blooded male, I can assure you. That with all of that, and just trying to know people, talk to people lovingly, some of the time anyway. Some and some. So the first two characters here, to get back to it, are the male characters are overly inclusive, which is odd because men are supposed to exclude primarily and be strong in a certain sense or potentially violent and threatening, whereas the female characters are actually negative and brutal, very off with her head, is about as brutal and aggressive as you can get. Women are actually known for, are identified, whether or not this is, everyone's behavior at all, are identified with positive and accepting emotions. I do think all of this is very interrelated. I think that Carroll is playing with it specifically. I think he is trying to figure out psychology before psychology was a word, and Psychologie was kind of a word in German I don't know well, the language of my people, the old country. So with all of this, and back to Britain here, we have that the male characters are actually a bit too inclusive, which is funny because that's opposite typical male behavior. But again, we know all types. It takes all types in Alice's own family plenty to have Alice anyhow. So then you have the female characters who are overly negative and exclusive, and that would make them, in a certain sense, weak men would, in a certain sense, be absurd bad men, and overly aggressive women, in a sense, I'm not trying to police anything, would be overly strong, aggressive bad women. So it's actually absurd and throwing a lot of behavior on its head. And please understand, I mean all of that inclusively, and I'm perfectly happy for people to not be happy with that whole situation. You understand me. So with all of that, and I come from the heart of San Francisco, over the hill from the Castro, I've been thinking about male-female behavior. What are those behaviors during my life? And I try to be inclusive and open-minded towards everyone. So that said, I'm not going to present my theories about gender right here, but think about how often men signal or don't or withhold violence and threats and negativity, and women give or withhold, sometimes in stereotypical, all too much ways, positivity in multiple roles of life. So, with all of that, and we're going to skate past all of that again, because we just got I'm miring us back in it. So the rabbit and the duchess, though, are particular because they're not so you have the play here of the male and the female, but you also have the play of the royalty and then the nervous lower characters who are jerk-like about their own houses to Alice and include and exclude her and are good and bad at relations and position, which is like Humpty Dumpty and the Red King, Tweedledum and Tweedledee and the Red King. I misspoke. The positions and the relations are bad, and you have these characters that are too partial, and then you have sort of somewhat the universal characters who are, I believe, the king and the queen of Wonderland of Hearts. And then you also have the queens, not king and queen of one side, but queens on either side of Alice as the universals. So you have here that the first two royal characters, again, are often overly particular and partial. That characterizes both of them. And the King and Queen of Hearts, the second two royal characters, are often overly general and universal without degree. You can see that they have problems with their personalities in being all too particular or all too general. The off with your head completely is way too much, and I'm going to include all evidence whether or not it conflicts with anything is way too inclusive. None of the four are wise. They all serve as excessive examples, like the queens on either side of Alice, that she is supposed to steer between, it seems, and she finds foolish and rejects each of the dreams when waking in the end of each, and declares all of it to be a bunch of foolishness each time. But she does gain something and temperance through the process and the time and the spaces she traverses, even if it's very much her mind. So similarly, in the Looking Glass, the Red Queen is overly exclusive and universal, like the Queen of Hearts, who says all ways are hers, which implies none at all are Alice's. That's very syllogistic reasoning, and that the ways our minds work are somewhat syllogistic. Not entirely, but somewhat. Aristotle was somewhat on to something, as was Gautama of India, the Chinese logicians, school of names, and others. Yes, a wheel does not touch the ground is similar in an odd inverted way to a umbrella's as sharp as a sword, but just the tip. So you have here that in the Looking Glass, again, the Red Queen, overly exclusive and universal, all ways are hers. She contradicts Alice entirely in all kinds of ways. She does somewhat help her. These characters can't be perfect characterizations of all or none and speak as normal, anyway, understandable creatures. But she shows Alice the distance she must travel, which is the full length. The Red King is overly exclusive and particular. He's off in his own dream. That's quite particular. And yet he includes Alice in his dream, we're told, but not with talking to her. So silently excluding her. Quite. Now here again, somebody could say, he's entirely excluding her, and therefore he's the nun. Yes, I could see that. It does seem to me, and again, Carroll may have problems fully representing these things. I think it is hard to make any character nun or and or anything. And I was first looking for ands and ors, and now I've turned to seeing much more of Aristotle. And first and foremost, I did figure when I started looking for this, it's best to find Aristotle first and then go looking for more modern ands or ors of De Morgan or anyone else. De Morgan doesn't, he distinguishes it in this and that way. So you now have that Alice and the Red King are including each other in their dreams, but neither is entirely real to the other, and it is left like whose is the dreamer in the dream here in a negative, terrible way, very much like the Cheshire Cat is the evil side of the key somewhat. The White Queen is then Immediately after the Red King, overly inclusive in general, she contradicts him the most, oddly, remembering time both ways and impossible things before breakfast, accepting Alice's help, turning into a sheep and dashing the full distance of the board. And the White King is overly inclusive and particular, including most but not all of his horses and men to help Humpty Dumpty and nervously encouraging both sides of the battle between lion and unicorn. Again, none are wise, and Alice wakes from her dream frustrated between the pieces. The looking glass shows what Aristotle, not Alice, calls subalternation twice, in fact. You will notice, if you chart this out, and I have, that each particular king follows his universal queen with a chapter and space in between. Now, there is not a space. It does not character space, character space, character space, character space. But it is, oddly, queen, space, king, queen, next, space, king. Now that queen space king pattern repeats twice, and what that could be, and actually is easy to fit with, subalternation is a fancy word that means if you know all A is B, you know some A is B necessarily, and if you know no A is B, then you necessarily know some A is not B. If I know all walruses are nice, then I necessarily know some walruses are nice. In fact, this is a lesson of logic which, again, doesn't make total sense to tell normal human beings entirely, because they would just assume it. It's nice to talk it out, but you would never say some walruses are nice if you knew they were all nice, unless you were being a bit facetious, deceptive, using logic in tricky ways, which we all are, and Carol certainly is. But also, so you would know if no walruses are nice, they're a bit prickly on the ends, that you would have a bit of the whiskers. Then you also know that some walruses are not nice. Of course, you know none of them are nice. You know all are not nice, yes? Playing with the pieces here. So again, Lewis Carroll was like Boole, and in the wake of Aristotle, quite long afterward. Lewis Carroll was testing the work of Boole, seeing what he liked of Aristotle, and it does appear to me that Lewis Carroll stuck with Aristotelian logic most of his life and then only grudgingly turned somewhat to symbolic logic. And you can read the opening of Symbolic Logic, and it seems like he is regrettably going to make this all more mathematical, like the times are increasingly in his time, which would be the onset then of Frege, Wittgenstein's truth tables, along with the assistance of Russell and his ideas and all of that. Facilitation, as a central player, actually, Russell, in bringing all that together. And read Logic Comics, actually, if you want more of this. I like Logic Comics, the graphic novel. I highly recommend that. It has a bit of Alice in it for the Society. If you have not yet read Logic Comics, it's all about Russell, but it will help explain some of what I say. Not all, though. So we see that, and so technically yes, all of that. So anyway, I am going to try to cap this also, like the last two talks, at about the half hour just after mark. But I have enough time here to just leave something that I also feel is convincing, because it just seems to emerge in reading just the first, the second, and then even if you like the third books, which are not many pages. I think the categories is 14 pages in the Penguin of English. So this is not, hardcore study time, not even a hardcore study hour. That if you read the works of Aristotle's logic, one scholar said it was Carroll's Bible. I don't think that's correct, and other Carroll scholars haven't mirrored that language. It wasn't his Bible, but he was very well familiar with this Aristotle in particular. Would probably discard a lot else of Aristotle as like, well, that's nice, but he wouldn't pay much attention to it. If you read the works of Aristotle carefully, you will find that he uses the colors white and red in the ways Carroll consistently uses the colors white and red to frame Alice's adventures. He also includes them in the snark, but as with the four forms of proposition and the snark, I am not going to come up with with detail about what in the snark fits these colors. This is simply about how these colors of Aristotle frame Wonderland and the Looking Glass as devices. White and red as overly timid child, overly aggressive adult. Black as ignorance. Unfortunately, again, we live in a good and bad world with many things. And then we also have golden, which is the golden balance and the golden afternoon and the gold on the sea and the snark. So let me simply quote myself verbatim. I like myself somewhat. The second suggestion I will make is that Carroll uses colors in ways Aristotle himself does to reflect balance as the overall lesson of Aristotle's ethics. Again, I don't know that Aristotle used gold as balance, but people used gold for Aristotle's balance a lot, and for the golden rule of Jesus, compared it to Aristotle, Confucius, and others. And I like all of that and have many a lecture on that in ethics. In his categories, Aristotle uses white and red as his examples of passive qualities, timid and too childlike, and says, quote, all colors, like white and black, are qualities as well as passive. We give them that name from the fact that they spring from affections or passions. Now, the white rabbit is passion in the beginning, I claim, and he is white and worried and timid, and he's late and he's freaked out. That's the first thing that leads into Wonderland, yes? There are numerous, this is continuing to quote Aristotle, there are numerous changes of color that clearly arise from affections. When men are ashamed, then they blush. When alarmed, they turn pale, and so on. So much is this really the case that, I think, Aristotle continues, when a man is by nature disposed towards shame or alarm, as rising from a certain concomitance of bodily elements in him, bodily fluids, we may not unfairly conclude that he takes on the corresponding color. Now this, I have talked a bit, not fully, and who does, about ethnicity and color words in Boole. Please see that with Boole, because he does talk about white men, white rabbits, and whether or not whiteness is a bunch of timid and civilized a little bit. But not entirely, but I steer you over to that, and actually Lewis Carroll is thinking a bit about ethnicity. But Lewis Carroll is very much following Aristotle in a lot of this, where temporary colors is not ethnicity, it is your emotional state at the time, and that is more how Aristotle was using the white and black people to mean temporarily emotional and or sick of a certain health condition. So golden might be, a decent balance in between, perhaps. So much of the glowing golden as opposed to too pale or too flushed. So, and again, obviously I know there are social and political issues with all of that, and again, please see my other videos, and I have not actually done videos to my liking about racism, psychology, and philosophy, but I do intend to do that, increasingly, because I do think those subjects are important. But here, the color words are temporary colors displayed in the individual, and Aristotle did not use those words the way we do, and other civilizations have, actually. It's a long story to signify ethnicities, but, again, that's a whole other story that we leave off here, purposefully, because we need to stick to this. So that is the quote of Aristotle. And so here, I will say, Carroll uses the colors white and red several times in Wonderland, the looking glass and the hunting of the snark, as Aristotle does, to signify affections and passions as states of character. The extremes of too weak, pale and white, and the extreme of too brash, flush and red. Aristotle actually says, if you're permanently aggressive, you are mad, which puns with the British word of Carroll and are mine and many of yours very well. If you're permanently mad, you're a raving lunatic, and my apologies about my, well, yes, I don't know current terms or forms of this, but of course Lewis Carroll in his day would agree somewhat, a la Bedlam Bethlehem. I believe the hospital Bethlehem was pronounced by the lower class Bedlam and is infamous, that with all of that, the permanently mad would be insane, and that is the Tea Party a bit. In fact, it's a lot, its whole duration, if it had one in time. So, in the beginning of Wonderland, Alice thinks of making a white daisy chain, chaining things together that are white right as she falls asleep, and follows the absurdly conjoined white rabbit, who's mixing others' interests with himself and thus is worried and is man and beast combined, which is very anti-Aristotle. We're even told the white rabbit has pink eyes. And I wouldn't even bring it up if Carroll described the characters much, but I've actually heard other scholars say, and again, my apologies for not mentioning names, Carroll doesn't describe the characters very much other than this with color words. He doesn't. So if I'm bringing up the rabbit's pink eyes and that sounds absurd and reaching, it's been said by other scholars, he lets the illustrations do the visualizing for the children, and he barely brings up color words about any of these characters at all, which means when he mentions the pink eyes, that may be a hint. Maybe. Again, because he doesn't offer those sorts of details often about the characters. That has been said by others. I believe Giuliano also said that in his work. I am not perfectly certain. He is also of the North America Lewis Carroll Society, the Lewis Carroll Society of North America. I keep mirror reversing it, but not entirely. So, with all of that, when she is daisy chaining things together, and the rabbit has pink eyes. In the end of Wonderland, Alice disrupts the King of Hearts' trial, wakes up and sweeps falling red leaves from her face that she mistook for the playing cards rising up against her. When she reaches the overly general in the garden of the Queen of Hearts, the first thing she sees is white roses painted red, and the Queen grows red in the face as she demands Alice's execution. Many of Carroll's favorite poets spoke of the purity of childhood with the color white. And I rely on scholars who have compared the poetry Carroll likes to his work. And in The Looking Glass, the White Queen is characterized as a carefree child, who's a little too carefree and open-minded and absent, with Alice pinning her shawl for her, and the Red Queen is an overbearing governess. I do not know, again, that Aristotle used the color gold in his work to mean balance, but his ethics centered on balance, and Christians such as Carroll spoke of the golden mean and the golden rule. Along with Confucius and others, they understood at all. Much like the golden key on the three-legged table, which is a golden ethics of balance on top of a syllogistic three-legged logic, very much. Wonderland begins all in the golden afternoon, a golden mean between waking day and sleeping night, and the snark is dedicated to a dear child in memory of golden summer hours, summer mid-year, and whispers of a summer sea, summer midway between new and old year, birth and death of the year, as afternoon is midway between day and night. If so, it does suggest that Alice's adventures and the Snark Hunt overall suggest the preservation of pure childlike love through patient interaction with the aggressive perspectives and positions of others, imbalanced, too timid, too aggressive, all over the place, tempered over time and tutored by positions in space, a white rose painted somewhat red, daisy chains leading to falling leaves, which leads to the golden balance, afternoon and key beyond death, enduring love onward to children who will have children, which is what Alice's sister sees in her mind in the final words of the tale. She sees the gold in Alice and the love and what endures through childhood but is tempered and thus not too timid. We have before the construal of the square and the board of Looking Glass. As children lead to children, and thus we preserve the childlike and it remains golden, all in the golden balance and afternoon. So again, thank you for your attention and time. Please see my other videos on all of that. I have way too much, and I will be breaking everything into chapters for easier consumption, like the sweetest of treats. So thank you to Edward Giuliano, Martin Gardner, William Warren Bardley, Mark Burstein, Christopher Morgan. I saw him briefly. I didn't have a chance to say a word to him, and my thanks. And to my family, friends, and students for their continuous patience and perspective, which I hope does me good, and I'm certain does them all better than me. So, as usual, much happiness, much love, much temperance over time, and I will see you, if I ever do manage to see you.